The morning began with a sharp chill that drifted across the training grounds, settling on the armor and uniforms of the gathered cadets like a thin layer of frost. The alien recruits shifted anxiously, each of them whispering about the rumored severity of the next survival trial. Ryan stood slightly apart from the group, calm and silent, observing the field with quiet attention. He watched the way the wind bent the grass, the way the distant trees swayed, and the way the Drillmaster approached with his usual heavy steps. The Drillmaster was known for harsh tests, but this morning his expression carried a particular firmness that silenced even the boldest cadets. He stopped before the formation and looked across the line with narrowed eyes, ensuring that every recruit felt the weight of his gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice rolled through the air like gravel scraping metal. He announced that the new trial would mimic the most primitive era of survival known across multiple worlds. He declared that every cadet would survive for 3 full days, using nothing more than what could be found in nature. He emphasized the rules with a tone that allowed no debate: no synthetics, no metals, no energy tools, no modern conveniences, only what a person could gather, shape, and use with completely bare hands. The group reacted immediately with visible dread. Some cadets exchanged horrified looks, others muttered about unfairness, and a few already appeared defeated before taking a single step into the wild. The Drillmaster remained unmoved. He wanted to see which cadets possessed true adaptability and which ones would collapse the moment their technology vanished. He ended his speech with a curt nod and stepped aside to let the gates open. Ryan tightened the straps of the simple pack issued for the trial. It contained nothing more than an empty water flask and a piece of cloth. The rest of the challenge would depend entirely on his ability to use the land. He did not fear the rules. In fact, he welcomed them. The forest beyond the gates resembled places he had trained in long before joining this program, places where silence mattered more than strength, and where improvisation was the only real weapon. As the gates slid open, the other cadets surged forward, driven by panic more than strategy. A tall insectoid recruit tripped over a stone in his haste. Another cadet from a reptilian species hissed irritably as a branch struck his face. Someone shouted about already losing sight of the path. Ryan stepped forward at a steady pace, neither rushing nor hesitating, letting the others scatter through the landscape while he paused to examine the environment with deliberate care. The soil was rich and dark, filled with moisture that suggested the presence of small streams nearby. The trees were tall, their bark rough and layered, a good sign for fire-starting techniques, even though he knew the trial would not immediately permit fire unless created through primitive means. Ferns and low shrubs indicated potential sources of fiber. Broken branches on the ground could serve as digging tools or primitive frames. Every detail mattered, and Ryan absorbed them with the ease of someone who had spent years studying natural survival rather than relying on equipment. Behind him, the Drillmaster observed the initial movements of the cadets. His eyes paused briefly on Ryan, not with approval, but with curiosity. He had seen countless recruits collapse under simpler conditions, yet Ryan approached the challenge as though it were an exercise rather than a punishment. The Drillmaster knew that the human cadet would not rely on strength alone. Instead, he would use intelligence in ways that the others rarely considered. Ryan entered the forest fully, letting the sound of the panicked cadets fade behind him. The atmosphere became something entirely different inside the tree line. The sense of sap, damp wood, and crushed leaves grew stronger with each step. Birds called overhead, unseen but loud enough to indicate the presence of untapped resources and potential dangers. He paused near a fallen log and knelt beside it, pressing his fingers into the decaying surface. It crumbled easily, which meant insects hid inside. Protein. Not ideal, but valuable. He noted the information and continued deeper. A shallow ravine soon opened before him, carved through the earth by seasonal water flow. Smooth stones lay scattered along its base, perfect materials for flint knapping or for creating friction surfaces. He picked up a few promising ones and weighed them in his hands, testing their durability with gentle taps. He stored the best stones in his cloth, tying the ends into a makeshift pouch. He climbed out of the ravine and followed the faint sound of trickling water until he found a narrow stream cutting through the undergrowth. The water was clear enough to see the bottom. Small fish darted between rocks, quick flashes of silver under the surface. The presence of aquatic life confirmed that he could eventually create fishing tools. For now, he filled his flask and moved on, already imagining how to use the fibers of river plants to create cordage. The first hour of the trial passed with most cadets still stumbling through the woods, arguing with one another, or attempting to climb trees in search of fruit. Ryan remained alone, steady, and focused. He crouched beside a cluster of tall plants with long, narrow leaves. He pulled one gently and tested its flexibility. It resisted breaking, bending instead. Perfect. He gathered several handfuls, carried them to a flat patch of ground, and sat cross-legged to begin separating fibers. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency as he twisted the strands into long, thin cords. He worked in silence, listening to the natural rhythm of the forest as the cord grew longer and stronger. By the time the sun reached its peak, Ryan already had the foundation of tools that the other cadets could not even imagine without synthetics. The trial had barely begun, yet he felt no pressure. He understood the terrain, he understood the rules, and most importantly, he understood himself. While everyone else tried to fight the restrictions, he embraced them. This trial was not a punishment. It was a demonstration of how much a person could accomplish when stripped to the essence of survival. And Ryan intended to show exactly that. Ryan remained seated on the forest floor long after the sun had passed its highest point, his hands moving with steady precision as he continued twisting and tightening the fibers he had collected. The strands began to form a cord long enough to wrap around his forearm several times, and he used small stones to press and smooth the surface so it would not fray under tension. He felt the cord's strength when he tugged on it, pleased by how little it stretched. This kind of material would allow him to create traps, secure bindings, and even improvise tools if the need arose. Once he finished the first coil, he set it aside and studied the surrounding plants, searching for thicker stalks and tougher fibers. He plucked a few candidates, soaked them in the cold water of the nearby stream, and returned to weave them into a stronger, heavier cord. This second cord required more force to twist, but the result would support more weight. He knotted the ends together, creating a loop he could wear over his shoulder, then gathered the remaining plant material into bundles for later use. With the cords finished, Ryan turned his attention to the stones he had collected earlier. He found a flat surface near the stream and placed the stones in a line before him. Each stone had a different texture and density, and he tested them with soft taps from a larger rock to hear how the vibrations traveled through the material. A sharp, ringing tone indicated a stone that could fracture into a blade. He pressed the tested stone against the larger one and struck it carefully. A flake sheared off, revealing a razor-sharp edge. He rotated the stone and struck again, shaping it into a more symmetrical form. He knew the blade would not last forever, but it would serve him well enough for cutting fibers, carving shapes, and preparing food once he secured it. He shaped another stone into a rounded hammer by chipping away flatter edges until the center formed a smooth curve. He then used a different stone to grind the surface, removing sharp points that might weaken it during impact. With the hammer ready, he began working on the concept of hooks. He knew he needed bone or thick wood as material, but he could begin by carving prototypes to understand the angle and strength required. He took a fallen branch and sliced into it with the new blade. The resistance was firm, but he managed to split the branch into strips. The blade sliced cleanly, proving the tool's usefulness. He carved a small hook shape, smoothing the edges with careful scraping motions. The curved piece would not withstand the pull of a strong fish, but it helped him refine the proportions. Satisfied with the prototype, he set it aside and searched for sturdier material. As he walked along the stream bank, he noticed small tracks pressed into the mud. Some were from insects, some from small mammals, but one set of prints suggested a creature with delicate bones. He followed the tracks until he discovered a shallow burrow beneath a fallen tree. The burrow was empty, but next to it he found the cleaned bones of an animal, likely scavenged by a predator earlier. The bones were thin but strong, especially the leg bones. He chose the longest one and snapped it open with a firm strike from the hammerstone. The bone split with a clean crack. He knelt and inspected the inner part, selecting a piece thick enough to carve without breaking easily. With patient, deliberate movements, he used the stone blade to shape the bone into a curved form. He filed the tip with the edge of the blade, turning it into a sharp point. The hook needed a notch for the cord, so he pressed the bone into a groove in a rock and chipped away at the upper curve until a small indentation appeared. He rubbed the edges to smooth them, testing the hook's strength by pulling on it with his fingers. It held firm. He repeated the process with several more bones, each time refining the angles and thickness until he created 3 hooks suitable for different uses. One was small and delicate for catching fish from shallow water. Another was medium-sized, suitable for traps requiring a trigger. The third was thicker and sturdier, capable of holding bait for larger creatures. He tied each hook to a short length of cord to test how well the fibers gripped the bone. The knots held tight, satisfying him with their reliability. After securing the hooks, Ryan moved deeper into the forest to search for wood that could be shaped into handles and supports. He found a tree with fallen branches that had dried in the sun, becoming lightweight yet stiff. He stripped one branch of its smaller twigs and began carving a groove near one end where the blade could be inserted. Once the groove was shaped, he pushed the sharpened stone blade into the slot and wrapped the joint with fiber cord to secure it. He reinforced the binding with a thin strip of bark, tightening it until the blade fit snugly. The result was a simple but useful stone knife with a wooden handle. He tested its grip, pleased with how the handle extended his leverage and reduced strain on his wrist. Next, he crafted a digging tool by selecting a thicker branch and carving one end into a wedge. He hardened it over a patch of sun-warmed stones, letting the heat dry the fibers until the wood stiffened. He knew that fire hardening was the most effective method, but until he created a friction-based fire, he needed to rely on sunlight and friction from scraping. Even without flames, the tool became firm enough to pierce soft soil. As he worked, he remained aware of the distant sounds made by the other cadets. Every few minutes, faint shouts and frustrated cries echoed through the forest. One voice yelled about a broken claw. Another complained about being unable to split a branch. Someone cursed loudly about a thorn bush that had ripped open a pack. Each sound reminded him how easily panic spread among recruits unused to environments where technology and instinct were the only choices. He was not indifferent to their struggles, but he knew he could not help them without jeopardizing his own progress. The trial demanded independence, and he intended to meet that expectation fully. He returned to the stream with his newly crafted tools and lowered one of the hooks into the water. Without bait, the chances were slim, but he wanted to test the hook's balance and the way the cord behaved when submerged. He watched the hook drift gently, settling near a cluster of submerged stones. The water's movement tugged at the cord, but the knot held securely. He retrieved the hook and examined it, satisfied that he had created something functional. Now that he had cordage, hooks, a blade, and a digging tool, he needed a way to store everything efficiently. He took several broad leaves from nearby plants and wove them into a pouch, reinforcing the edges with narrow strips of fiber. He placed his tools inside, rolled the pouch, and tied it with the longer cord he had braided earlier. The compact bundle hung easily across his shoulder. As the sunlight began to dim, Ryan surveyed his surroundings and considered his next steps. The forest was full of potential materials, and he had only begun unlocking their usefulness. His mind already turned toward the idea of more complex tools, snares, and shelters. The beginnings of a plan took shape as he imagined constructing not just weapons, but systems that could support him through the coming days. The first tools were complete, and with them came the confidence that the next stage of survival would unfold in his favor. Ryan moved along the stream with careful, deliberate steps, noting how the water shifted around stones and formed small pools where fish tended to gather. He knew that the stream's shallows were ideal for using simple hooks, but he also understood that fish would not approach an empty hook without scent or movement. He searched the mud for signs of small insects and lifted a handful of wet earth, examining the wriggling larvae beneath the surface. He separated a few, washed them briefly in the stream, and threaded one onto the smallest bone hook. The movement of the larva provided the lure he needed, and he lowered the hook into the water with slow, controlled motions. He crouched beside the stream for several minutes, watching the line drift with the current. A flash of movement beneath the water signaled a fish approaching. He remained completely still, letting the stream do the work. The fish nudged the bait once, then again, and finally took it fully into its mouth. Ryan pulled the cord upward with a firm yet fluid motion, lifting the fish out of the water and onto the bank. It flailed violently, but he pinned it gently with his hand and removed the hook. He set the fish in a shallow pit he had lined with damp leaves so it would not dry out in the sun. He repeated the process, baiting the hook with more larvae, adjusting his position to follow the movement of the school. 2 more fish snapped at the bait within minutes. He knew he could continue fishing until the entire school dispersed, but he had enough for now. He placed the fish into a woven basket he crafted earlier and carried it farther upstream where the water was colder. He submerged the basket in a shaded pool, weighing it down with stones so the fish would remain fresh while he explored further. After securing the catch, he set off into the forest in search of edible plants. The terrain shifted as he moved away from the stream. The air grew warmer, and the density of vegetation increased. He recognized several species of ferns whose roots could be roasted or dried. He dug up a few using the wooden tool he had crafted, brushing off the soil and examining the roots for firmness. The healthy ones went into his leaf pouch. The brittle or rotted ones he discarded. He continued until he reached a cluster of berry bushes. The berries were a deep, rich shade, but he did not touch them immediately. He crushed one between his fingers and watched the color spread across his skin. The juice was vibrant but had a faint chemical smell that suggested mild toxicity. He tasted the smallest smear from his fingertip. Not enough to swallow, just enough to sense bitterness. He confirmed the berries were not ideal for eating raw. They might be safe if boiled, but he would wait until he had a reliable heat source. For now, he marked the location in his memory and returned to exploring. He ventured deeper into a section of forest where the undergrowth became sparse and the trees grew taller. Here, he found signs of small mammals, narrow dig marks, scattered pellets, and thin trails pressed into the soil. He followed one of the trails and discovered a clearing where the ground was soft enough to hold footprints. The prints belonged to a creature that walked on 4 legs, roughly the size of a rabbit. He examined the direction of the tracks and constructed a simple snare using one of his medium-sized hooks, a loop of cord, and a flexible sapling. He bent the sapling, tied the trigger mechanism, and positioned the loop exactly where the creature would step. Once the snare was set, he camouflaged it with dry leaves and stepped back to observe the clearing from a distance. He knew that success required patience, so he left the snare and returned to the stream to process the fish he had already caught. He retrieved the basket from the cold pool and carried it to a large, flat stone. Using his stone knife, he made precise cuts along the sides of each fish, removing the heads, tails, and innards. He washed the fillets in the stream and set them on a clean rock nearby. He needed salt to preserve the fish until he constructed a stable method of curing. He searched along the canyon wall adjacent to the stream, scraping the surface of light-colored mineral deposits. The deposits broke apart into coarse crystals. He tasted the tiniest grain, confirming it was natural salt. He collected a handful into a small bark container and sprinkled it generously over the fish, pressing the crystals into the flesh. Once the fish were salted, he laid them across a set of thin branches, arranged like a drying rack. The sun would draw out some of the moisture, but he knew that proper curing required smoke. He was not ready to build a smokehouse yet, but he could prepare the fish so they would not spoil before he reached that stage. He placed the rack in a breezy area where insects would not gather easily. With the fish secure, he returned to check on the snare. The forest was quiet when he approached, but as he drew near the clearing, he noticed the sapling bent upward unnaturally. The snare had sprung. He moved forward carefully and found a small animal suspended upside down, struggling in the loop. The creature was frightened, but unharmed. He approached calmly, ended its struggle swiftly, and removed it from the loop. He placed the animal into his pack and reset the snare, knowing another might wander into the clearing. He carried the small animal back to the stream and prepared it with the same precision he used on the fish. After removing the fur and organs, he inspected the meat for parasites. Finding none, he washed it thoroughly and salted it lightly. This meat would serve as a richer source of protein once he built the smokehouse. He explored further along the water's edge, searching for additional food sources. He found patches of edible reeds that could be chewed for moisture or cooked for fiber-rich starch. He cut several stalks and tied them together with a strip of cord. He continued downstream and discovered a section where moss covered the rocks in thick, spongy layers. He collected the moss, knowing it could be used as insulation or filtration later. When he returned to his drying rack, he checked the fish for firmness. The edges had begun to stiffen slightly under the salt. He left them in the sun and used the remaining daylight to gather more materials for future tools. He collected smooth stones, dry bark, and several sturdy sticks that could serve as frame supports. As he worked, he listened to the forest changing around him as dusk approached. The air cooled, the shadows lengthened, and the sounds of the diurnal creatures quieted while the nocturnal ones emerged. Before nightfall, he inspected the snare one final time and found a second small animal trapped. He removed it with practiced efficiency and carried it back to his work area. With this additional supply, he felt confident he could maintain stable nutrition through the next stages of the trial. He prepared the meat and set it aside for smoking. The food he gathered, the traps he set, and the careful management of each resource formed the foundation of his survival strategy. He understood that the smokehouse would transform his raw supplies into lasting sustenance, but before he built it, he needed the right materials, the right structure, and the right airflow. He gathered the branches and stones he had collected earlier and envisioned the layout in his mind. Every piece of the environment offered potential, and he intended to use it with absolute precision. Ryan stood beside the drying fish as dusk settled across the forest, allowing the cooler air to touch his skin while he considered the structure he needed to build. The smokehouse had to be stable enough to withstand night winds, enclosed enough to trap smoke effectively, and elevated enough to prevent animals from reaching the curing meat. He scanned the surrounding terrain, searching for a natural formation that would reduce his workload. His eyes settled on a cluster of boulders near the stream, arranged by nature in a rough semicircle. The stones created a shallow alcove that offered shelter on three sides. It was the ideal foundation. He approached the alcove and examined the stones, running his hand along the rough surfaces. The interior space was small but sufficient. He knelt and cleared the ground, removing loose soil and scattered leaves to reveal a patch of hard earth. A solid base would prevent stray embers from spreading once he lit the fire beneath the structure. With slow, steady motions, he used his digging tool to carve a shallow pit in the center of the alcove. He shaped it into an oval depression and lined the bottom with flat stones he collected earlier. The stone layer would distribute heat more evenly and guard against moisture seeping upward. Next, he began gathering poles for the frame. He walked through the forest with a careful selection process, picking branches that were neither brittle nor too thick to shape. He chose approximately 10 branches, stripping them of leaves and side shoots. He carried them back to the alcove and arranged them in a loose pile beside the fire pit. He measured the length of each branch by holding it vertically and marking where it should be trimmed. Using his stone knife, he cut the ends into points, sharpening them enough to drive into the soil around the pit. He placed the branches in a circular pattern, forming a kind of low dome structure. Each branch curved inward as he pressed it into the ground, and he secured the intersections with loops of cord he braided earlier. He tightened the bindings until the framework resembled a rounded cage. To reinforce the frame, he wove thin, flexible branches through the gaps, creating a lattice that would support the weight of bark tiles and damp leaves. Once the frame was stable, Ryan gathered bark from fallen logs. He searched for bark pieces that had naturally separated from the wood, ensuring he did not harm living trees unnecessarily. He selected pieces that were thick enough to retain heat, yet lightweight enough to position easily. He layered the bark along the frame, overlapping each piece to form a continuous roof. The result resembled a primitive hut, though the interior remained open near the bottom to allow controlled airflow. He then collected armfuls of large, broad leaves from nearby plants. He pressed the leaves against the bark layer, using additional cord loops and small wooden pegs to keep them in place. The leaves would help regulate smoke flow, preventing it from escaping too quickly. The smokehouse now had a distinct shape, rounded, sturdy, and sealed, except for a small opening near the top where the smoke would vent slowly. Satisfied with the outer shell, Ryan returned to the fire pit and arranged small twigs into a tight bundle. He placed slightly thicker sticks around the center, forming a pyramid structure that allowed air to pass between each piece of wood. He added damp moss around the perimeter, knowing the moss would smolder and produce thick smoke once the fire began to burn low. He also set aside a pile of green leaves and damp bark to create additional smoke when needed. Before lighting the fire, he constructed a simple rack inside the smokehouse. He took 2 sturdy sticks and laid them horizontally across stones he placed at opposite sides of the pit. He then wove thin branches between the supports, creating a grid that could hold the meat above the heat source. He tested the rack by placing his hand on it, ensuring the grid held steady without wobbling. He gathered the fish he had salted earlier and laid them carefully across the grid. The thin fillets hung slightly over the edges, allowing more surface area to absorb the smoke. He also placed the small animals he had prepared earlier, spacing them evenly to avoid overcrowding. He stepped back and surveyed the arrangement. It was efficient, balanced, and ready for the smoke to begin its work. He knelt beside the pit and prepared to start the fire. Creating flame without modern tools required patience and technique, but he had gathered the materials he needed during the day. He selected 2 dry sticks, 1 straight and 1 flat. He carved a small notch into the flat one, then pressed the straight stick into the notch and rolled it quickly between his palms. The friction heated the wood, sending small curls of smoke rising from the indentation. He increased the speed, focusing his strength downward until a glowing ember formed. He tipped the ember into a bundle of dry fibers he kept for this exact purpose and blew gently. The fibers ignited into a small flame. He transferred the flame to the twigs in the fire pit. The twigs crackled softly as they caught fire, and he added thin sticks to strengthen the flame. Once the fire burned steadily, he placed the damp leaves and moss around the edges. The fire responded with a thick plume of smoke that rose slowly into the smokehouse. He adjusted the bark layer and leaf covering until the smoke filled the interior evenly. The air inside the structure darkened as the meat absorbed the smoke. With the smokehouse functioning, Ryan sat nearby to monitor the airflow. The fire needed to remain low enough to prevent cooking, yet high enough to dry the meat gradually. He fed small pieces of wood into the fire, watching the smoke thicken and swirl. He listened to the crackle of the damp bark as it released aromatic vapors that coated the meat. The forest air took on a new scent, deep, earthy, and rich with the unmistakable aroma of curing. As night settled fully, the forest grew darker, but the glow from the fire illuminated the alcove. Ryan remained alert, adjusting the structure when necessary. He added more moss when the smoke grew thin, and he carefully repositioned a bark tile when he noticed an opening too wide for proper containment. He worked with the precision of someone accustomed to long nights in unfamiliar environments. Hours passed as the smokehouse transformed the raw fish and meat into preserved food. The smoke rose in steady waves, bathing each piece evenly. Ryan inspected the meat at intervals, checking for firmness and the beginnings of the rich surface texture that signaled effective curing. The edges of the fillets curled slightly, becoming denser. The small animals developed a dark sheen that indicated deep absorption of the smoke. He stepped outside for brief moments to gather additional fuel and to listen for any signs of predators. The smoke acted as a deterrent, but he remained cautious. The forest was alive with night sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, and the faint trickle of the stream. He understood the forest well enough to know when danger approached, and tonight the sounds remained consistent and predictable. Through the longest stretch of the night, he maintained the rhythm of feeding the fire and adjusting the smokehouse. The process demanded patience, but the reward would be a reliable food source that could last for days. As the horizon brightened with the first hint of dawn, he lifted one of the fillets to inspect it. The surface was firm, the color deepened, and the scent rich with smoked salt. The technique had worked. The smokehouse stood as a complete structure now, functional, sturdy, and capable of sustaining him through the remainder of the trial. The success of the night gave him confidence that the days ahead would be far easier. He would refine the process, gather additional meat, and maintain the smokehouse as long as the trial continued. The foundation was set, and he had everything he needed to turn survival into stability. The first light of dawn crept across the forest floor, casting pale gold across the smokehouse as Ryan stepped back from the pit and let the fire die into a bed of warm embers. A faint trail of smoke still drifted upward, carrying the scent of cured meat into the crisp morning air. The structure had held perfectly through the night. The bark tiles remained firm, the bindings tight, and the interior warm enough to preserve the food without burning it. Ryan stretched, feeling the ache in his shoulders from hours of tending the fire, and then lifted each piece of meat from the rack. The fish had a darkened surface and a firm, dry texture. The small animals carried the deep, smoky aroma that confirmed the curing had taken fully. He wrapped the meat in layers of broad leaves and tied the bundles with cords, making them easy to transport. He stepped outside the alcove and listened to the forest waking around him. Birds fluttered overhead, insects buzzed through the air, and small animals rustled through the undergrowth. For a moment he allowed himself the stillness of the early morning before turning his attention to the final tasks he needed to complete before inspection. He cleaned the fire pit, covering the embers with stones to cool them. He checked his traps and found one more small creature caught overnight. He prepared it with the same careful motions he used before and added it to the bundles he carried. As the sun continued to rise, the signal horn echoed through the forest, sharp and commanding. The trial was coming to an end. Ryan gathered his tools, slung the bundles of smoked meat across his shoulder, and began the walk back through the forest toward the meeting grounds. His steps were steady, unhurried, and confident. He knew what he had accomplished, and he understood the value of each technique he had used. The path grew clearer as he approached the designated clearing where the cadets were told to assemble. When Ryan arrived, several cadets were already there, each showing varying degrees of exhaustion and frustration. Some had torn clothing from thorn bushes, others carried handfuls of roots or wilted plants. A few sat on the ground, clearly worn down by the ordeal. Ryan could see in their expressions the fatigue that came from struggling with an environment that demanded constant adaptation. He set his bundles beside him and observed the group quietly. He noticed that many cadets glanced at him with a mix of confusion and disbelief as they caught the scent of the smoked meat he carried. The Drillmaster approached with slow, deliberate steps. His presence immediately silenced the murmurs. His gaze traveled across the cadets one by one, evaluating their condition and the results of their efforts. His eyes narrowed slightly when he noticed the disappointed expressions of many students. He stopped walking and folded his arms behind his back before addressing the group. He asked each cadet in turn to present what he or she had gathered or crafted during the trial. One insectoid cadet offered a handful of bitter nuts that he had struggled to open. The Drillmaster inspected them and returned them without comment. A reptilian cadet showed a bag of unripe berries that he had collected but had been unable to prepare properly. Another cadet had only a few wilted plants and a poorly constructed shelter frame made from branches that had snapped during the night wind. The Drillmaster listened in silence as each cadet tried to explain the difficulties he or she experienced. When it was Ryan's turn, he stepped forward and opened the leaf bundles. The rich scent of smoked meat filled the air. The Drillmaster raised an eyebrow as Ryan displayed the fish fillets, the smoked carcasses of small animals, and the additional strips of meat he had prepared. The Drillmaster examined a piece closely, pressing his fingers into the firm surface and lifting it to his nose. The aroma was unmistakable, well-preserved, deeply smoked, and expertly cured. Ryan stood silently as the Drillmaster inspected the results of his work. The Drillmaster then asked him to explain how he had achieved this result. Ryan described the process calmly: the gathering of fibers for cordage, the shaping of hooks, the construction of tools, the gathering of fuel, and the methodical building of the smokehouse itself. As he spoke, the cadets around him listened in stunned silence. Many had not even considered the possibility of curing meat without modern tools, and the idea of constructing a smokehouse had seemed unimaginable to them. The Drillmaster remained silent for a long moment after Ryan finished speaking. His eyes shifted from the bundles of smoked meat to the other cadets, who had struggled to gather even the most basic supplies. He finally addressed the group, his voice carrying the weight of conclusion. He stated that he had issued a simple command: Stone Age only. The command was intended to strip the cadets of their reliance on technology and force them to face the environment with nothing but ingenuity. He explained that many had failed to understand the purpose and had attempted to survive with minimal effort or panic-driven improvisation. He turned to Ryan and acknowledged that he had not only followed the rules, but had expanded the trial far beyond its expectations. He emphasized that surviving with raw materials was one challenge, but transforming those materials into a functional system was something far greater. The Drillmaster then proclaimed that Ryan had demonstrated not just survival skills, but mastery, an understanding of how to convert scarcity into abundance through patience, observation, and methodical execution. The cadets stood quietly as the Drillmaster continued. He stated that discipline was not measured by brute strength or frantic labor, but by the ability to think clearly under restrictions. He pointed at the smokehouse meat and said it represented more than food. It represented foresight, adaptability, and respect for the environment. He gave Ryan a rare nod of approval, a gesture that carried significant weight in a program where praise was nearly non-existent. The Drillmaster then dismissed the cadets, instructing them to reflect on their performance. As the others packed their belongings with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration, Ryan gathered his bundles once more. A few cadets approached him hesitantly, asking how he had learned to build such structures. He answered simply, explaining that he had practiced similar methods long before joining the academy. He shared a few brief insights, offering them encouragement rather than superiority. Once the cadets dispersed, the Drillmaster approached Ryan alone. He told him that the academy needed individuals who understood the principles of survival beyond technology. He emphasized that such knowledge formed the foundation of leadership, because a true leader guided others even when the world stripped away every comfort. He concluded by stating that Ryan had passed the trial with distinction. Ryan nodded, accepting the words with quiet respect. As he stepped out of the clearing and walked toward the transport that would return him to the main training grounds, he felt a sense of calm satisfaction. He had entered the trial with nothing but his hands and his understanding of nature. He now left with the knowledge that he had proven himself not just to the Drillmaster, but to himself. He had taken the simplest materials and crafted not only food and tools, but stability and resourcefulness in a situation designed to break him. The forest behind him remained still, carrying the faint scent of smoke into the air, a reminder of what he had built and what he had learned. He walked forward, knowing that the lessons of the trial would remain with him long after the smoke faded. The conclusion of the trial was not merely survival, it was mastery, earned through patience, discipline, and the quiet certainty that innovation thrived even in the oldest, simplest conditions.